There are moments in politics when something happens and most people only catch the headline. What just happened in Minnesota is one of those moments. Because while many Americans saw a headline about Trump ending a program for Somali immigrants, very few understood why he did it, how it connects to Ilhan Omar's district, and what kind of investigation triggered it behind the scenes. This isn't a small administrative adjustment. This is a decisive move aimed at dismantling a network that federal investigators say has been draining taxpayer funds, rerouting money overseas, and destabilizing an entire region of the state. Trump just shut down a program affecting hundreds of people tied to a fraud network worth somewhere between $250 and $300 million. And somehow, all of it circles back to Minneapolis and a political figure whose district is now under more scrutiny than at any time in recent memory. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why so few outlets are explaining the real reason behind Trump's decision, and why this could reshape the political future of Ilhan Omar and Minnesota as a whole. And I want to do this in a way that makes sense, because this story matters to every American who pays taxes, who trusts their government to manage programs honestly, and who wonders what happens when those systems break down. So let's start at the beginning. What actually triggered all of this? What made the President of the United States look at one state, one community, and say enough? Trump announced he was terminating something called temporary protected status for Somali immigrants living in Minnesota, effective immediately. Now, if you're not familiar with TPS, it's essentially a legal shield the government grants to people from countries facing disaster or conflict. It allows them to stay in America temporarily without fear of deportation. It's meant to be compassionate, humane, a safety net for people fleeing genuine danger. But here's where things took a hard turn. Trump cited large-scale welfare fraud, money laundering, and the discovery that millions of taxpayer dollars had been funneled into overseas networks, some even reaching extremist groups, according to federal reports. He wasn't just ending a program. He was responding to something much bigger, much darker, that had been unfolding for years. Now, before we dive into the political fallout, we need to understand the system that allowed this to happen in the first place, because this isn't really a story about immigration policy. It's a story about what happens when oversight fails, when programs designed to help vulnerable people get hijacked by organized networks, and when state leaders either don't notice or choose not to act. Minnesota has become home to the largest Somali population in the entire country. We're talking somewhere between 75 and 85,000 people. That's a sizable community. Many arrived as refugees over the past couple of decades, fleeing violence and instability back home, and part of that community includes immigrants who received TPS status. Now, investigators began discovering something troubling. Multiple coordinated schemes were targeting programs meant to help vulnerable Americans, meal programs for children, medical support systems, housing assistance for people with disabilities. Think about that for a moment. Programs designed to feed hungry kids. Programs meant to help people with autism get therapy. Programs to keep seniors and people recovering from addiction in stable housing. These aren't abstract government line items. These are lifelines for real people. And someone figured out how to game the system to turn compassion into profit. The details of these schemes reveal why the fallout is so massive. Let me walk you through what federal authorities uncovered, because understanding the mechanics helps you see why Trump's response was so decisive. Investigators found operations involving fake meal invoices, people claiming they'd fed thousands of children who didn't exist, fabricated therapy sessions where no therapist ever showed up, forged diagnoses for non-existent autism patients, inflated housing support claims where services were never actually provided. Some of these cases ballooned from just a few $1,000,000 to over $100 million per year. 100 million in a single program in a single state. The growth was so rapid, so extreme, that it overwhelmed the system. State officials couldn't process the volume of claims. Auditors fell behind. Red flags got ignored because there simply weren't enough people watching. And here's where it gets really troubling. The money didn't stay in Minnesota. According to analysts and federal reports, large sums were being sent overseas, eventually filtering into territories controlled by Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked group in Somalia. Now, I want to be careful here. Most Somali immigrants in Minnesota are hardworking, law-abiding people who came here for a better life. They're not involved in this. But there were organized networks exploiting community connections, using remittance systems to move money, and in some cases, those funds ended up in very dangerous hands. In parts of Somalia controlled by these groups, there's essentially a tax on any money coming in from abroad. So even if someone sends money home to help family, a portion gets skimmed off the top. It's extortion, really. And when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars flowing out of Minnesota, even small percentages add up fast. One analyst put it bluntly, the single largest funder of Al-Shabaab in the world might just be the Minnesota taxpayer. Now, once that connection surfaced, attention naturally turned to the political leadership responsible for oversight. And that's where things got uncomfortable for a lot of people in state government. Governor Tim Walz faced criticism from both conservatives and Democrats who argued that warnings about fraud had been ignored for years. People started asking hard questions. How did these programs expand so quickly? Why didn't state leaders intervene sooner? And who, if anyone, benefited from the political silence? Think about it from a taxpayer's perspective. You work your whole life, you pay into systems that are supposed to help people who genuinely need it. And then you find out that billions, yes, billions over several years have been siphoned off through fraud, not just wasted through inefficiency, but stolen through deliberate schemes. How does that make you feel? For seniors especially, this hits differently, because many of you remember when government programs were smaller, more accountable, easier to track. You remember when a dollar spent actually reached the person it was meant to help, and you've watched over the decades as programs grew larger, more complex, and seemingly more vulnerable to abuse. This Minnesota situation is a perfect case study in what happens when scale outpaces accountability. With investigators uncovering broader patterns, the focus shifted to the congressional district at the center of it all. And that district is represented by Ilhan Omar. Now, let's be clear and fair here. Currently, there's no evidence that Omar herself participated in any fraud. But her district is where many of the accused operators lived or worked. The programs under investigation, the community networks being examined, the donors who funded various operations, all of this traces back through areas she represents. Some individuals connected to these networks had previously interacted with her campaign or community organizations she supported. And then there was the video. Back in 2021, Omar recorded a publicity video for a restaurant in Minneapolis called Safari Restaurant. It seemed harmless at the time, promoting a local business, showing support for a community. But that restaurant later became central to one of the fraud investigations. It was allegedly a front for a money laundering operation using fake meal distribution as cover. The optics, in hindsight, were devastating. Omar has claimed no involvement in the scandal whatsoever, and again, there's no direct evidence tying her to the fraud schemes. But politically, the damage was done. Because when you represent a district where this level of organized crime is happening, people start asking, how did you not know? What were you doing while this was unfolding? Why didn't you sound the alarm? And then the political shockwave hit not just for Omar, but for thousands of her supporters, because Trump's announcement didn't just end a program on paper. It instantly affected somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Somali residents with TPS status. Many of them lived in areas that overwhelmingly support Omar. Many had built lives in America over 10, 15, even 20 years. They had jobs, families, roots. Overnight, people who had been legally protected for years suddenly faced the possibility of removal, and the reaction inside Minneapolis was immediate and intense. Local leaders accused Trump of targeting an entire community for the actions of a few. Residents expressed fear and frustration. Some activists claimed this decision could destabilize entire neighborhoods, tear apart families, destroy livelihoods. The emotional weight of it was real and heavy. Meanwhile, others argued that the fraud was too extensive, too damaging, too connected to dangerous groups overseas to ignore. The political temperature spiked, especially for Omar, whose critics used the scandal to question her leadership, her priorities, and her effectiveness. But Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't just a political story, it's a system story, and for seniors, it's about something even more fundamental than politics. It's about taxpayer money. Your money. Money that was intended to support programs like meal assistance, disability services, medical care. The investigation showed how vulnerable systems can be overwhelmed by coordinated fraud, draining resources that were meant for Americans who genuinely need help. Imagine you've paid into Social Security your whole working life. You expect it to be there when you retire. Now imagine finding out that billions were being stolen from similar programs through fake claims and nobody stopped it for years. That's the feeling a lot of Americans have right now about what happened in Minnesota. And that brings us to the long-term consequences. Because Trump's action sets a precedent. It sends a message. If a state fails to manage its programs, if fraud gets out of control, if taxpayer money ends up funding dangerous groups overseas, federal intervention becomes a real possibility. Minnesota could face deeper audits, new restrictions, or federal oversight of programs that used to be managed entirely at the state level. For Omar, the political challenges are just beginning. She may face pressure from within her own district, especially if voters feel the system was mismanaged or that leadership failed to protect them. She'll have to answer difficult questions about oversight, about what she knew and when, about whether her political priorities blinded her to problems festering in her own backyard. So what comes next? That's the question everyone's asking. Because this decision doesn't exist in a vacuum. It ripples outward in ways most people haven't fully considered yet. This decision signals a broader shift in how federal leaders might approach immigration-related fraud across the country. Other states with large TPS populations are watching closely. If you're a governor in a state with significant refugee or immigrant communities, you're probably looking at your own programs right now, wondering if you have the oversight mechanisms in place to catch this kind of activity before it spirals out of control. Political debates around TPS, welfare programs, and state accountability are about to get much louder, especially as we head into election cycles, because this touches on so many hot-button issues at once. Immigration, government spending, national security, fraud, terrorism financing. It's a perfect storm of controversy, and politicians on both sides will use it to make their case about what America should look like, how we should manage our borders, and what responsibilities we owe to people who come here seeking refuge. Now, I want to take a step back for a moment and talk about something that often gets lost in these heated debates. The human element. Because it's easy to look at numbers, $250 million, $300 million, and feel outraged. It's easy to read about terrorism connections and feel afraid. But there are real people on all sides of this story who are hurting. There are Somali families in Minnesota who had nothing to do with any fraud, who are now terrified they'll be deported back to a country many of their children have never even seen. There are American families who relied on meal programs or housing assistance and watched funding dry up because the money was stolen. There are investigators and law enforcement officers who spent years building cases, trying to stop the bleeding, frustrated that the system moved so slowly. And there are seniors, people like you, who watch all of this unfold and wonder, how did we get here? How did programs meant to help people become vehicles for organized crime? And more importantly, how do we fix it? Those are the questions that matter most. Because outrage is easy. Assigning blame is easy. But actually reforming systems, actually building accountability without destroying the compassionate purpose behind these programs, that's the hard work. Let me give you an analogy that might help. Think of these government assistance programs like a community garden. The idea is beautiful, right? Everyone contributes a little, and in return, people who need food can come and take what they need. It works when everyone acts in good faith. But what happens when organized groups start showing up at night, harvesting everything, selling it for profit, and shipping the money overseas? The garden dies. The people who genuinely needed it go hungry. And eventually, someone has to step in and say, we're shutting this down until we can figure out how to protect it. That's essentially what Trump did. He looked at a system that had been completely overwhelmed and said, this stops now. We're revoking the protection status, we're cutting off the fraud networks, and we're sending a message that this won't be tolerated. Now, reasonable people can disagree about whether that was the right approach. Some will say it was too broad. that it punished innocent people for the crimes of a few. Others will say it was the only way to send a strong enough message to stop the bleeding. But what nobody can disagree with is this. The system failed, spectacularly, and someone had to act. For Minnesota, the road ahead is uncertain. The state will likely face intense federal scrutiny for years. Every program, every claim, every dollar will be examined more closely. That might mean better accountability in the long run, but it also means bureaucracy, delays, and frustration for people who depend on these services. For Ilhan Omar, the political calculus has shifted dramatically. She's been a polarizing figure since she entered Congress, celebrated by progressives for her bold stances, criticized by conservatives for her positions on Israel, foreign policy, and immigration. But this scandal hits differently because it's local, it's concrete, and it's tied to something everyone understands: theft. Her opponents will argue she should have known, should have acted, should have been a watchdog instead of a cheerleader. Her supporters will argue she's being unfairly blamed for a systemic problem that predates her time in office. The truth, as it usually is, probably lies somewhere in between. She may not have been directly involved, but leadership means taking responsibility for what happens in your district, and this happened on her watch. The national ripple effect is already beginning. Conservative media outlets are using this story as a case study in what they see as failed progressive policies, open borders, expansive welfare programs, lack of oversight. Progressive media outlets are framing it as an example of Trump's cruelty, his willingness to punish entire communities for the actions of criminals. Both narratives contain elements of truth, and both miss the bigger picture. We live in a time of incredible complexity. Our government systems are massive, sprawling, difficult to manage. Our immigration system is broken in ways that create vulnerabilities. Our welfare programs are essential but also susceptible to fraud when oversight can't keep pace with growth. And our political leaders on both sides often lack the courage to address these problems honestly because the solutions require nuance, compromise, and political risk. What happened in Minnesota is a symptom of all of these larger failures. It's what happens when compassionate intentions meet inadequate systems, when community trust gets exploited by organized networks,